The coffee shop fell silent except for the sound of shattering glass. What had started as a typical Tuesday morning erupted into chaos when 3 armed men burst through the door, demanding everyone hit the floor. Customers screamed, baristas ducked behind the counter, and panic filled the air like smoke. But in the corner booth, a quiet woman in her 50s didn't move. She didn't scream. She didn't duck. Margaret Maggie Torres had been coming to this same coffee shop every Tuesday for 3 years. The staff knew her as the polite lady who always ordered a black coffee and sat alone, reading paperwork from her job at the local hardware store. She was invisible in the way that middle-aged women often become, overlooked, underestimated, forgotten. The gunmen didn't notice her at first. They were too busy shouting orders and waving weapons. But when the lead gunman turned toward her corner, expecting to see another terrified civilian, he found something else entirely. He found 20 years of Navy SEAL training staring back at him. What happened next would shatter everything this small town thought they knew about the quiet woman who sold hammers and garden hoses. Because Margaret Torres wasn't just anybody. She was somebody who had spent 2 decades in the shadows, protecting her country in ways most people couldn't imagine. And today her secret was about to explode into the light. This is the story of how a woman who had been invisible her entire civilian life became impossible to ignore. It's about the weight of secrets, the power of a past that refuses to stay buried, and what happens when a warrior is forced to choose between hiding and fighting. Some people spend their whole lives trying to be noticed. Margaret Torres had spent hers trying to disappear. But on this Tuesday morning, disappearing was no longer an option. The fight was about to begin. Margaret Torres wiped down the same section of counter for the 3rd time, her movements precise and methodical. At 52, she had perfected the art of being unremarkable. Her graying hair was always pulled back in a simple ponytail. Her clothes were practical and plain, and she spoke just enough to be polite, but never enough to be memorable. The hardware store where she worked had become her sanctuary of anonymity. Customers came in looking for screws and paint, not expecting the woman behind the register to have stories that could fill books. She preferred it that way. After 20 years of being someone else entirely, Margaret had earned her right to be nobody. The bell above the door chimed as old Mr. Henderson shuffled in, looking for weather stripping for his kitchen window. Margaret guided him through the options with quiet efficiency, her voice steady and unremarkable. She had helped hundreds of customers just like him over the past 3 years. Each interaction a small reminder that her new life was working exactly as planned. But even as she rang up his purchase, muscle memory from another lifetime kicked in. She noticed the way the man favored his left leg, suggesting an old injury. Her eyes automatically swept the store's reflection in the window, checking exits and identifying potential threats. Old habits died hard, especially when those habits had kept her alive through missions that officially never existed. The routine of civilian life had become her disguise. Every morning, she woke up in her small apartment above the town's only bakery. The smell of fresh bread would drift upward, mixing with the sound of the early morning delivery trucks. She would make her coffee black, no sugar, just the way she had learned to drink it during endless nights on surveillance. Then, she would walk the 6 blocks to Martinez Hardware, unlock the doors, and become the person everyone expected her to be. Nobody in Millbrook knew that Margaret Torres had once been Staff Sergeant M. Torres of SEAL Team 7. Nobody knew she had spent 2 decades infiltrating hostile territories, gathering intelligence that shaped international policy, and executing operations that would never appear in history books. To them, she was just the helpful lady who knew the difference between wood screws and machine screws, who could recommend the right type of paint for any project, and who never caused any trouble. The transformation hadn't been easy. After her medical discharge 3 years ago, the Navy had offered her positions that would have kept her in the world she knew. But Margaret had seen enough shadows for one lifetime. She had watched too many good people disappear into missions that went wrong, had carried too many secrets that weighed her down like stones in her pockets. So she had chosen Millbrook, a town small enough that strangers were noticed, but boring enough that they were quickly forgotten. She had chosen a job that required no background checks beyond the basics, no references that might raise questions. She had chosen to become invisible. The transition had been harder than any mission she had ever undertaken. Learning to walk at a normal pace instead of the purposeful stride that had carried her through hostile territories. Training her eyes to look at people instead of automatically scanning for threats. Remembering to smile at appropriate times, to make small talk about weather and local news instead of maintaining operational silence. But the hardest part had been learning to ignore her instincts. Every time someone approached her too quickly, every time a car backfired, every time she heard raised voices, her body wanted to react the way it had been trained for 20 years. Instead, she had to remember to flinch like a normal person, to look startled instead of immediately tactical. The town of Millbrook made it easier. With a population of just over 8,000, it was the kind of place where the biggest excitement was the annual Corn Festival. The police department consisted of 6 officers who spent most of their time dealing with domestic disputes and teenagers drinking in the woods behind the high school. Crime was limited to the occasional theft from unlocked cars and disputes between neighbors over property lines. Margaret had rented her apartment from Mrs. Chun, who owned the bakery downstairs. The older woman had asked few questions beyond the standard landlord inquiries, satisfied with Margaret's references for what appeared to be previous retail jobs, but were actually carefully crafted cover stories maintained by people who understood the value of protecting former operators. The apartment itself was sparse, but comfortable. A single bedroom with a bed that Margaret still made with military precision every morning. A small kitchen where she prepared simple meals that bore no resemblance to the field rations she had subsisted on for years. A living room with a couch, a television she rarely watched, and windows that offered clear sight lines to all approaches to the building. She had chosen the location deliberately. The apartment was on the 2nd floor, providing elevation and multiple exit routes. The bakery below operated on predictable hours, giving her advance warning of any unusual activity. The street was wide enough to spot trouble coming, but narrow enough to control if necessary. Even in retirement, Margaret Torres thought like a soldier. Her job at Martinez Hardware had been another calculated choice. The store was owned by Roberto Martinez, a Vietnam veteran who understood that some people preferred not to talk about their past. He had hired her based on her obvious competence with tools and her ability to deal with customers without creating drama. He didn't ask why someone with her obvious organizational skills was content to work retail, and she didn't volunteer the information. The work itself was surprisingly satisfying. There was something peaceful about helping people solve simple, fixable problems. A leaky faucet could be repaired with the right washer. A squeaky door could be silenced with proper oil. A wobbly table could be stabilized with adjusted legs. After years of dealing with problems that had no clean solutions, the straightforward nature of hardware issues felt like a gift. Margaret had developed relationships with regular customers, though she was careful to keep them surface level. There was Mrs. Patterson, who came in every few weeks for gardening supplies and always asked about Margaret's family, accepting vague responses about relatives who lived far away. There was Jim Rodriguez, a local contractor who appreciated Margaret's ability to pull exactly the right supplies for whatever project he described. And there was Sarah Mitchell, a young teacher who was slowly renovating an old house and relied on Margaret's guidance through each repair. These interactions filled Margaret's days with the illusion of normalcy. She offered advice about paint coverage and screw lengths, recommended contractors for jobs too big to handle alone, and listened to stories about home improvement victories and disasters. She learned the rhythms of small-town life. Busy weekends when people tackled projects, quiet weekday mornings when only serious contractors shopped, and the seasonal rushes for lawn care in spring and winterization in fall. But even as she settled into her new identity, Margaret remained vigilant in ways that her neighbors couldn't understand. She noticed when new people came to town, mentally cataloging their appearance, and behavior until she was satisfied they posed no threat. She observed changes in local routines, the way delivery schedules shifted or how foot traffic patterns evolved. She monitored the police scanner app on her phone, staying aware of any unusual activity that might indicate larger problems. The hyper-awareness was both a blessing and a curse. It had kept her alive through situations that had killed other operators, but it made truly relaxing impossible. Even during quiet moments in the hardware store, part of her mind remained on duty, ready to respond to threats that would almost certainly never materialize in a place like Millbrook. 3 years into her civilian life, Margaret had achieved something that had seemed impossible during her military service: stability. She had a routine, a purpose, and a place in a community that accepted her without questions. She had traded the adrenaline and danger of special operations for the steady rhythm of small-town commerce. And most days, she convinced herself it was a fair exchange. But deep down, Margaret knew that her past was not something that could be permanently left behind. 20 years of training and experience had become part of her DNA, changing her in ways that no amount of civilian routine could completely erase. She was like a weapon that had been carefully stored but never truly disarmed, always ready to function exactly as designed if the situation demanded it. That situation was about to demand everything she had tried to leave behind. The Tuesday morning started like every other Tuesday morning in Margaret's carefully constructed routine. She woke at 5:30 a.m. without an alarm, a habit from 2 decades of military discipline that her body refused to abandon. The smell of fresh bread from Mrs. Chen's bakery below drifted through her apartment windows, mixing with the cool autumn air that carried hints of the changing season. Margaret dressed in her usual work clothes: dark jeans, a plain gray sweater, and comfortable shoes that looked casual but provided the support and flexibility she might need if her past ever caught up with her present. She made her coffee black and strong, standing at her kitchen window as she sipped it, automatically scanning the street below for anything unusual. Millbrook was waking up according to its predictable schedule. The mail truck made its early run past the courthouse. Mrs. Patterson walked her ancient golden retriever along the same route she had taken every morning for the past 3 years. The high school students who lived in her neighborhood shuffled toward the bus stop, backpacks slung over shoulders, lost in their phones and teenage concerns. Everything appeared normal, but Margaret noticed the small details that others would miss. The way the mail truck slowed slightly as it passed her building, just as it had every day for 3 years. The fact that Mrs. Patterson's dog had developed a slight limp in his back left leg, probably arthritis setting in. The new car parked across the street that hadn't been there the night before, though it bore local plates and looked like the kind of reliable sedan that any sensible person might drive. These observations were automatic now, filed away in the part of her mind that never truly went off duty. In her SEAL days, such attention to detail had meant the difference between successful missions and catastrophic failures. Now it was just background noise in a life designed to be forgettable. Margaret finished her coffee, locked her apartment, and walked the 6 blocks to Martinez Hardware. The morning air was crisp enough to see her breath, and the leaves on the old oak trees that lined Main Street were beginning their transformation from green to gold. Millbrook in autumn was postcard pretty, the kind of place that made people think about simpler times and slower lives. The hardware store was her second stop of the morning. First, she had walked past Riverside Coffee, the little shop where she treated herself to a better cup of coffee every Tuesday before work. It was one of the few indulgences she allowed herself, a small break in the discipline that had governed her life for so long. The coffee shop was busy with the usual morning crowd. Teachers grabbing caffeine before school, contractors fueling up for long days on job sites, and retirees who treated their morning coffee run as a social event. Margaret had never been part of that social scene. She ordered her coffee, found a quiet corner booth, and used the time to review paperwork from the hardware store and plan her day. It was while she was sitting in that corner booth, reading through inventory reports and supplier catalogs, that her carefully constructed civilian life began to unravel. The first sign of trouble was subtle. A man at the counter was taking too long to place his order, his eyes scanning the room in a way that reminded her of surveillance techniques she had learned years ago. The second man entered 2 minutes later, positioning himself near the door in what could have been coincidence, but felt like tactical placement. Margaret's instincts, dormant but never dead, began to stir. She continued reading her paperwork, but her awareness expanded to include every person in the coffee shop, every exit, every potential weapon within reach. The sugar dispenser on her table could become a projectile. The heavy ceramic mug could be used for striking. The booth itself provided limited cover, but excellent sightlines. When the third man entered, Margaret knew with absolute certainty that trouble had found her quiet Tuesday morning. The men moved with the kind of coordination that spoke of planning and practice. They weren't random criminals looking for easy money. They were professionals, and their presence in Millbrook could only mean one thing. Someone had found Margaret Torres. The question was whether they were here to bring her back or to make sure she never talked about what she knew. The leader of the three men was tall and lean, with the kind of build that came from years of physical conditioning. His eyes swept the room with military precision before settling on Margaret. When their gazes met, she saw recognition flicker across his features, followed immediately by surprise. He hadn't expected to find her here, in this place, living this life. The recognition was mutual. Margaret knew the face, though it had aged and hardened since she had last seen it. Commander Daniel Shaw, former Navy intelligence, had been her handler for several operations in the Middle East. He had been the voice in her earpiece during some of the darkest missions of her career, the man who sent her into situations where failure meant more than just mission compromise. But Shaw wasn't supposed to exist in her new world. His presence in Millbrook meant that the wall she had built between her past and present had been breached, and that could only lead to catastrophic consequences for everyone around her. Shaw made a subtle gesture to his companions, and Margaret recognized the hand signals from joint operations protocols. They were preparing to move, but they wanted to minimize civilian casualties. That told her two important things. They weren't here to kill her outright, and they still followed some version of the rules of engagement she remembered. But it also told her that they were serious about whatever had brought them to her quiet coffee shop on a Tuesday morning. Margaret closed her paperwork carefully and placed it in her bag. Her movements were casual, unremarkable to anyone who might be watching, but she was actually preparing for action. The bag contained her keys, her phone, and a small utility knife that she carried for opening packages at work. Not much of an arsenal, but she had been trained to make weapons from whatever was available. More importantly, she was preparing mentally for the transition from Margaret Torres, hardware store employee, to Staff Sergeant Torres, special operations veteran. It was a shift she had hoped never to make again, but 3 years of civilian life hadn't erased the ability to flip that switch when survival demanded it. Shaw began moving toward her table, his companions maintaining their positions to control the space. Margaret calculated distances, timing, and probabilities. The coffee shop had 2 exits, the main door where one of Shaw's men waited, and a back exit through the kitchen that led to the alley behind the building. There were 17 other people in the shop, most of them oblivious to the drama unfolding around them. If this turned violent, innocent people would be hurt. That was unacceptable. Margaret stood slowly, her body language conveying calm resignation. To the other customers, she probably looked like someone preparing to leave for work. To Shaw, she was communicating her willingness to talk before anyone got hurt. "Margaret," Shaw said as he approached her table. His voice was low, pitched so that nearby customers couldn't hear clearly. "We need to talk." "I figured," Margaret replied, her own voice equally quiet. "Outside." Shaw nodded toward the front door. "My car is parked across the street." Margaret recognized the sedan she had noticed earlier. She should have trusted her instincts more completely, but 3 years of civilian life had dulled some of her paranoia. That was a mistake she couldn't afford to make again. As they moved toward the door, Margaret's mind raced through possibilities. Shaw's presence could mean several things, none of them good. There might be a situation requiring her specific expertise, though that seemed unlikely given her unofficial status. There might be a security breach that compromised her new identity, forcing relocation and another painful transition to a different life. Or there might be something darker, operations she had been involved in that were coming back to haunt the people who had authorized them, secrets that needed to be buried permanently, along with the people who carried them. Outside the coffee shop, the autumn air felt different, sharper, more dangerous. Margaret's senses expanded to catalog every detail of the street, every potential threat or advantage. The carefully maintained illusion of being a normal person in a normal town evaporated like morning mist. Shaw led her to the sedan, where a fourth man waited behind the wheel. Margaret recognized him too. Petty Officer Collins, a communications specialist she had worked with in Afghanistan. The presence of people she knew from her operational days made the situation both better and worse. Better because they were professionals who understood the rules. Worse because it meant this was serious enough to activate personnel from her old unit. "Get in," Shaw said, opening the passenger door. Margaret paused at the threshold. Once she got in that car, her life in Millbrook would be over one way or another. The hardware store would wonder why she didn't show up for work. Mrs. Chun would eventually notice that her apartment had been abandoned. The customers who relied on her advice about home improvement projects would have to figure things out for themselves. 3 years of careful construction, gone in a moment. But she had always known this day might come. Deep down, beneath all her hopes for a quiet civilian life, Margaret had understood that some secrets were too important to stay buried forever. Some skills were too valuable to remain unused. Some people were too dangerous to be allowed complete freedom. She got in the car. As they drove away from downtown Millbrook, Margaret caught a glimpse of Martinez hardware in the side mirror. Through the front window, she could see Roberto setting up for the day's business, unaware that his most reliable employee would never return. The woman who had spent 3 years becoming nobody was about to discover that her country still needed her to be somebody. And this time, there might be no going back to invisible. The safe house was exactly what Margaret expected. A nondescript ranch home on the outskirts of the next town over, the kind of place that real estate agents would describe as perfect for a quiet family. But Margaret knew better. The reinforced door frames, the strategically placed security cameras, and the way the windows had been treated to prevent electronic surveillance told a different story entirely. Shaw led her inside without ceremony. The living room had been converted into a temporary command center, with multiple laptops, secure communication equipment, and wall-mounted monitors displaying what appeared to be satellite imagery of various global locations. 3 other people waited inside, all faces she recognized from her operational days. Lieutenant Colonel Sarah Martinez sat behind the main computer station, her fingers dancing across keyboards with the same precision that had made her legendary in intelligence circles. To her right stood Chief Petty Officer James Walker, whose expertise in demolitions had gotten Margaret out of more than one tight situation overseas. At the far end of the room, Captain Rebecca Foster reviewed files spread across a makeshift table, her expression grim in a way that suggested the news was worse than Margaret had imagined. "Before you ask why we're here," Shaw said, settling into a chair across from where Margaret remained standing, "you should know that officially, this meeting never happened. None of us are supposed to be here, and you're supposed to be living your quiet retirement in peace." Margaret felt a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn air outside. But unofficially, Foster looked up from her files. "Unofficially, we have a problem that requires someone with your specific skill set and operational history. Someone who can get into places that regular channels can't reach. And someone who doesn't officially exist," Martinez added, not looking away from her screens. "Because if this goes wrong, the government needs complete plausible deniability." Margaret had heard similar briefings before, usually preceding missions that pushed the boundaries of international law and common sense. The fact that they were having this conversation in a civilian safe house rather than a military facility told her everything she needed to know about how far outside normal channels this operation was running. "I'm retired," she said, though she knew how weak the words sounded even as she spoke them. Walker let out a bitter laugh. We're all supposed to be retired. Foster left the Navy 18 months ago. Martinez is officially working as a cybersecurity consultant. Shaw runs a private military contracting firm that definitely doesn't take on the kind of jobs we're talking about. And yet here we all are, Shaw added. Because sometimes retirement is a luxury that people like us can't afford. Foster spread a series of photographs across the table. 3 weeks ago, a team of our people went dark during what should have been a routine intelligence gathering operation in Eastern Europe. No contact, no distress signal, no trace of what happened to them. Margaret moved closer to examine the photographs. She recognized the format: satellite surveillance images, intercepted communications logs, and what appeared to be mission planning documents. The kind of intelligence package that preceded high-stakes operations in hostile territory. Official channels have been exhausted, Martinez said, finally turning away from her computers. The State Department claims they have no knowledge of American personnel in the area. The Pentagon maintains that all special operations forces are accounted for. The CIA insists their people are nowhere near the region. But, unofficially, Shaw continued, we know that 6 operators from various elite units were tasked with infiltrating a facility that intelligence sources suggested was being used for weapons development by a group with ties to several international terrorist organizations. Margaret studied the photographs more carefully. The target facility appeared to be a former Soviet research installation, the kind of place where Cold War scientists had developed technologies that both sides had preferred to forget. Such facilities dotted the landscape of Eastern Europe, most of them abandoned and forgotten, but some repurposed by groups with agendas that made their original purposes seem benign. What kind of weapons development? She asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. Foster pulled out another set of documents. Chemical agents. Specifically, compounds that could be weaponized for use against civilian populations in ways that would be difficult to trace or defend against. The implications hit Margaret like a physical blow. Chemical weapons had been banned by international treaty for good reason. They were indiscriminate, horrific in their effects, and virtually impossible to contain once released. In the hands of terrorist organizations, such weapons could cause casualties on a scale that conventional explosives could never match. And you think your missing team discovered something that got them captured or killed, Margaret said. We think they discovered something that someone is willing to kill for, Shaw replied, which means the weapons development is probably further along than our intelligence suggested. Margaret walked to the window, though she was careful to stay back from the glass. Outside, the neighborhood looked peaceful and ordinary. Children's bicycles lay abandoned on front lawns, and the biggest concern seemed to be which houses needed their gutters cleaned before winter arrived. But she knew how quickly that kind of peace could be shattered. She had seen what happened when weapons of mass destruction fell into the wrong hands, had witnessed the aftermath of chemical attacks that turned busy marketplaces into scenes from humanity's darkest nightmares. Why me? She asked, though she was beginning to understand the answer. Martinez turned her laptop screen so Margaret could see it clearly. Because you've been inside facilities like this before. Because you know how to get intelligence out of hostile territory when regular communications are compromised. And because you have operational experience with some of the same people who might be involved in this weapons program. The screen showed a series of photographs that made Margaret's blood run cold. Faces she recognized from missions she had tried to forget. People who had chosen to use their military training for purposes that went far beyond anything their original oaths had encompassed. Viktor Kozlov, she said, recognizing the man in the central photograph. I thought he was dead. So did we, Foster replied. Until his name started appearing in intelligence reports related to the facility, our people were sent to investigate. Margaret remembered Kozlov well. He had been a Soviet Special Forces officer who had transitioned to mercenary work after the collapse of the USSR. During her time in the Middle East, she had encountered him twice. Once as an adversary during a mission to extract a compromised asset, and once as an unwilling ally when circumstances forced temporary cooperation. Kozlov was intelligent, ruthless, and completely without principles beyond personal profit. If he was involved in chemical weapons development, it meant the program was sophisticated, well-funded, and extremely dangerous. He won't be easy to find, Margaret said, and he definitely won't be easy to approach. That's why we need someone he might remember, Shaw explained. Someone he might underestimate because he remembers them from a different context. Margaret understood the logic, but she also understood the risks. Kozlov had a long memory and a longer list of enemies. If he was involved in the kind of operation they were describing, he would be paranoid, heavily protected, and quick to eliminate threats. And if I refuse? She asked. The room fell silent for a moment. Finally, Foster spoke. Then, 6 American operatives probably die, if they haven't already. A chemical weapons program continues to develop capabilities that could kill thousands of innocent people. And Viktor Kozlov continues to profit from technologies that could reshape terrorism as we know it. But, Shaw added quickly, if you refuse, we'll respect that decision. We'll find another way, even if it takes longer and involves more risk to civilian populations. Margaret knew they were telling the truth. These were people she had served with, bled with, trusted with her life on multiple occasions. They wouldn't try to coerce her into a mission, no matter how desperate the circumstances. But they also knew her well enough to understand that she couldn't walk away from this kind of threat. For 3 years, she had convinced herself that her service was over, that she had earned the right to a quiet life free from the weight of other people's secrets and the responsibility for other people's lives. She had built a world where the most dangerous thing she faced was an irritated customer upset about the wrong type of screws. But that world had been an illusion, maintained only as long as the larger world stayed stable enough not to need her skills. How long do I have to decide? She asked. The extraction window opens in 72 hours, Martinez said. After that, the weather in the target region becomes too unpredictable for insertion operations until spring. 72 hours to decide whether to abandon the life she had built and return to the shadows that had defined her for 2 decades. 72 hours to determine whether Margaret Torres, hardware store employee, would disappear forever so that Staff Sergeant Torres could complete one final mission. I need to think about it, she said. Shaw stood up. Collins will drive you back to town. Take the time you need, but remember that every hour we delay reduces the chances that our missing people are still alive. As Margaret prepared to leave the safe house, Foster handed her a secure phone. If you decide to help us, use this to make contact. If you decide not to, destroy it and go back to your life. Either way, this conversation never happened. Margaret pocketed the phone and followed Collins back to the sedan. During the drive back to Millbrook, she stared out the window at the countryside that had become familiar over the past 3 years. Rolling hills dotted with farmhouses, small streams running beside the road, forests that exploded with color as autumn took hold. It was beautiful in its simplicity, peaceful in a way that she had learned not to take for granted. But beneath that beauty, hidden from view but never truly absent, lay the darker reality that made such peace possible. Someone had to stand watch in the shadows. Someone had to be ready to act when diplomatic solutions failed and conventional forces weren't enough. For 20 years, Margaret had been part of that shadow world. For 3 years, she had tried to pretend it didn't exist. Now she had to decide which reality she could live with. Collins dropped her off at the hardware store, where Roberto was dealing with the usual afternoon rush of contractors and homeowners tackling weekend projects. Margaret slipped in through the back entrance and threw herself into the familiar rhythm of work, helping customers find what they needed and processing orders for items that weren't in stock. But even as she went through the motions of her civilian job, her mind was processing everything she had learned at the safe house. Chemical weapons, missing operatives, Viktor Kozlov, a window of opportunity that was closing with every passing hour. As closing time approached, Margaret found herself standing in the same spot where she had stood every evening for 3 years, turning off lights and securing the store for the night. But this time, she wondered if it might be the last time she performed this familiar ritual. The secure phone felt heavy in her pocket, weighted with the decision that would determine the rest of her life. Outside, Millbrook settled into its peaceful evening routine, unaware that one of its residents was contemplating a return to a world where peace was a luxury that most people couldn't afford. Margaret spent the night walking through Millbrook's quiet streets, each familiar corner a reminder of the life she was about to abandon. The secure phone felt like a stone in her pocket, growing heavier with each step. By dawn, she had made her decision, though she suspected she had known what choice she would make the moment Shaw had walked into the coffee shop. She called the number at exactly 6 a.m. "I'm in," she said simply when Shaw answered. "I knew you would be," he replied, and she could hear both relief and sadness in his voice. "Collins will pick you up in 2 hours." Margaret spent those 2 hours saying goodbye to a life that most people would never know she had lived. She left a note for Mrs. Chun, explaining that a family emergency required her immediate departure, and that her rent was paid through the end of the month. She wrote a letter to Roberto at the hardware store, thanking him for the opportunity to work there and apologizing for the sudden departure. She packed light, taking only what could fit in a single duffel bag. 3 years' worth of civilian memories, reduced to a few photographs and the comfortable clothes that had helped her blend into small-town life. Everything else would stay behind, artifacts of an identity that would soon cease to exist. The extraction point was a military airfield 2 hours outside of town, the kind of place where planes landed without filing flight plans and departed without official destinations. Margaret had been to similar facilities dozens of times during her operational career, but never as someone leaving behind a life she actually cared about losing. The aircraft waiting for them was a modified transport plane, equipped with the kind of advanced communications and surveillance equipment that officially didn't exist. The interior had been configured for long-range missions, with sleeping quarters, a briefing area, and secure storage for equipment that would be needed once they reached their destination. Margaret's team for this operation included familiar faces and new ones. Shaw would coordinate intelligence and communications from a remote location. Martinez would handle electronic surveillance and cyber operations. Walker would provide demolitions expertise and tactical support. Foster would serve as mission commander, making final decisions when circumstances required real-time adaptation. The new faces belonged to operators from different services, each chosen for specific skills that might be needed in the field. There was Marine Captain David Chun, a language specialist who spoke fluent Russian and several Eastern European dialects. Navy Lieutenant Sarah Rodriguez brought medical training and experience treating chemical exposure victims. Air Force Technical Sergeant Michael Thompson handled advanced surveillance equipment and drone operations. During the flight to their forward operating base in Germany, Foster briefed the team on everything intelligence services had learned about the target facility and the missing operatives. The picture that emerged was more complex and dangerous than Margaret had initially understood. The facility wasn't just developing chemical weapons. It was creating delivery systems that could spread chemical agents over wide areas using commercially available drones and conventional explosives. Such systems would be nearly impossible to detect or intercept, giving terrorist organizations the ability to launch attacks that could kill thousands of people with equipment that could be purchased legally and assembled in any garage. The missing American operatives had been part of a joint task force investigating the facility, but their last communication suggested they had discovered something that went far beyond simple weapons development. Intelligence analysts believed they had uncovered evidence of an international network, with cells in multiple countries preparing to use the weapons once development was complete. The timeline is accelerated, Foster explained as the aircraft crossed into European airspace. Our missing people sent a burst transmission before they went dark, indicating that the weapons testing phase is nearly complete. Once that happens, the facility will be abandoned and the technology will be dispersed to operational cells. Margaret studied the intelligence package more carefully during the remainder of the flight. The target facility was located in a remote region of Moldova, housed in a former Soviet research complex that had been abandoned since the early 1990s. The area was sparsely populated, with the nearest town more than 50 kilometers away, making it ideal for covert operations, but also perfect for the kind of work that required complete secrecy. Recent satellite imagery showed significant activity at the facility, multiple vehicles, construction equipment, and what appear to be extensive security measures. Guard towers have been erected at strategic points, and the perimeter was protected by both electronic surveillance and human patrols. Most concerning was the presence of a helicopter landing pad and what appeared to be a small airstrip, suggesting that the facility was designed for rapid evacuation, if necessary. If Kozlov and his associates detected any threat to their operation, they could disappear within hours, taking their technology and their captives with them. The forward operating base in Germany was another anonymous facility, the kind of place where special operations forces stage for missions that required complete deniability. Margaret's team spent 2 days there, refining their approach and gathering equipment that would be needed for infiltration and extraction. The plan itself was elegantly simple, which Margaret knew was usually a sign of either brilliant strategy or desperate improvisation. A small team would infiltrate the facility during a shift change in the security rotation, locate and extract the missing operatives, and gather intelligence on the weapons program for destruction by follow-up airstrikes. Margaret's specific role would be to gain access to the facility's interior systems, both to locate their missing people and to gather intelligence on the chemical weapons program. Her experience with similar Soviet-era installations, combined with her history with Kozlov, made her the logical choice for direct contact with facility personnel. But everyone involved understood that the mission's success depended on variables they couldn't control: the condition of the missing operatives, the security measures they would encounter, and whether Kozlov would recognize Margaret quickly enough to either help or kill her. The insertion took place during a moonless night, with the team parachuting into a forested area approximately 15 kilometers from the target facility. Margaret hit the ground hard, feeling muscles that had been softened by 3 years of civilian life protesting the sudden return to operational stress. But her training took over immediately. Within minutes, she had gathered her equipment, confirmed communication with the team, and begun moving toward the objective. The forest was dense and dark, providing excellent cover, but also concealing potential threats from facility security patrols. The approach took 4 hours of careful movement through terrain that shifted between thick forest and open farmland. Margaret's senses, sharpened by adrenaline and the return to operational status, cataloged every sound, every movement, every detail that might indicate danger or opportunity. The facility appeared exactly as the intelligence reports had described: a cluster of concrete buildings surrounded by high fencing and guarded by professionals who knew their business. But Margaret could see weaknesses in their security setup, gaps in coverage that her team could exploit if they moved carefully and timed their approach correctly. More importantly, she could see signs that the facility was preparing for some kind of major activity. Additional vehicles had arrived since the last satellite surveillance, and there was an urgency to the movement of personnel that suggested either an imminent operation or preparation for evacuation. Margaret activated her communication system and reported her observations to Foster, who was coordinating the mission from a concealed position 2 kilometers away. The news confirmed everyone's worst fears. They were running out of time. "We go tonight," Foster decided. "If they're preparing to move, we may not get another chance." Margaret checked her equipment one final time. In addition to standard infiltration gear, she carried documents that identified her as a freelance security consultant interested in purchasing advanced weapons technology. If she could get close to Kozlov, the cover story might buy her enough time to locate their missing people and gather critical intelligence. But she also carried backup equipment that told a different story: explosives, communication intercept devices, and weapons that could ensure the mission's success even if diplomatic approaches failed. As darkness fell over the Moldovan countryside, Margaret prepared to become someone she had hoped never to be again. The hardware store clerk who helped neighbors with home improvement projects was about to disappear forever, replaced by a special operations veteran whose job was to prevent weapons of mass destruction from falling into the wrong hands. The transition felt as natural as breathing, despite 3 years of civilian life. Margaret's body moved with the fluid efficiency of someone who had spent decades training for exactly this kind of situation. Her mind processed threats and opportunities with the clarity that came from understanding that failure meant death for herself and potentially thousands of innocent people. As she approached the facility's perimeter, Margaret caught sight of a figure in one of the guard towers who seemed familiar. Even at a distance, she recognized the precise movements and alert posture of someone she had worked with during previous operations. One of their missing operatives was still alive, still in position to provide support if they could establish contact. Margaret smiled grimly as she prepared to infiltrate the facility. The mission had just become significantly more complex, but also significantly more hopeful. For the first time in 3 years, Staff Sergeant Torres was exactly where she belonged. The final phase of her return to the shadows was about to begin. Margaret moved through the facility's outer perimeter like a ghost returning to haunt familiar ground. The Soviet-era construction was exactly what she remembered from similar installations. Thick concrete walls, narrow corridors designed to channel movement, and ventilation systems large enough for a person to navigate if they knew the right access points. Her infiltration route took her through a drainage culvert that led directly under the main laboratory building. Intelligence had suggested this was where the chemical weapons development was taking place, and where their missing operatives were most likely being held. The culvert was cramped, wet, and filled with the smell of decades-old industrial waste, but it provided undetected access to the heart of the facility. Margaret emerged into a sub-basement that appeared to have been recently renovated. New electrical systems ran along walls that had been reinforced with modern materials. Security cameras monitored key access points, but she had studied their placement during her approach and knew how to move through their blind spots. The sound of voices drew her attention to a stairwell that led to the upper levels. She could hear English being spoken with American accents, confirming that at least some of their missing operatives were still alive. But she could also hear other voices speaking in Russian and what sounded like Serbian, suggesting that the facility's security force was more international than intelligence reports had indicated. Margaret activated her communication system and transmitted a brief status update to Foster. The response came back immediately. Proceed with caution, but gather intelligence on both the missing personnel and the weapons program before attempting extraction. The main laboratory level was a maze of corridors connecting rooms that had been converted from their original Soviet research purposes to accommodate modern chemical synthesis equipment. Through reinforced windows, Margaret could see sophisticated apparatus for creating and testing chemical compounds, along with computer systems that were analyzing molecular structures and delivery mechanisms. But it was what she saw in the central laboratory that made her blood run cold. Chemical weapons weren't the only thing being developed in this facility. In sealed chambers, she could see biological growth medium and what appeared to be viral cultivation equipment. The implications hit her like a physical blow. This wasn't just about chemical weapons that could kill thousands. This was about biological weapons that could kill millions. Margaret photographed everything she could see through the laboratory windows, using equipment designed to work in low-light conditions without triggering detection systems. The images would be transmitted automatically to intelligence analysts who could determine the full scope of what was being developed in this forgotten corner of Eastern Europe. Movement in the corridor ahead forced her to find concealment in an equipment closet that smelled of industrial solvents. Through the partially open door, she watched as Viktor Kozlov himself walked past, accompanied by 2 men who were clearly providing security rather than technical expertise. Kozlov had aged since she had last seen him, his hair now completely gray and his face marked by lines that spoke of stress and hard living. But his eyes still held the sharp intelligence that had made him one of the most dangerous operatives of his generation, and his movement suggested that years of mercenary work had kept him in excellent physical condition. More importantly, he was carrying a tablet that displayed what appeared to be shipping schedules and delivery locations. If Margaret could get access to that device, she might be able to identify where the weapons were intended to be deployed and when attacks were planned to begin. As Kozlov disappeared around a corner, Margaret made a decision that went against every tactical principle she had ever learned. She was going to approach him directly. The plan was insane, but it might be the only way to get the intelligence they needed and locate their missing operatives before the facility was evacuated. Kozlov knew her, remembered her from operations where they had been adversaries and reluctant allies. There was a chance, however, slim, that he might be willing to negotiate rather than simply eliminate her. Margaret found him in what appeared to be the facility's command center, a room filled with monitoring equipment and communication systems that connected the isolated laboratory to networks around the world. He was alone, studying data on multiple screens while speaking into a secure satellite phone. She waited until he finished his call before stepping into the doorway. "Hello, Victor," she said in Russian, keeping her hands visible and her posture non-threatening. Kozlov spun around with the fluid motion of someone whose survival instincts had been honed by decades of dangerous work. His hand moved toward a weapon, then stopped as recognition flickered across his features. "Margaret Torres," he said, switching to English. "I wondered when you would appear. Though I must admit, I expected it to be sooner." "I've been retired," she replied, moving slowly into the room while maintaining distance from anything that could be used as a weapon. "But some situations don't allow for retirement." Kozlov laughed, but there was no humor in the sound. "Retirement is a luxury that people like us can rarely afford. Please sit. We have much to discuss." Margaret chose a chair that provided clear sight lines to all exits while keeping her hands free for rapid movement. Kozlov settled behind a desk that was positioned to provide both cover and command of the room's approaches. "Your people are alive," he said without preamble. "3 of them, anyway. The others died during the initial infiltration attempt, though I suspect you already know that." Margaret kept her expression neutral, though relief and anger warred in her chest. 3 alive was better than none, but 3 dead meant that this mission had already cost more than anyone had wanted to pay. "I assume you're here to extract them," Kozlov continued, "along with intelligence about our work here. The question is whether we can reach an accommodation that serves both our interests." "What kind of accommodation?" Margaret asked, though she suspected she already knew what he was going to propose. Kozlov activated a wall-mounted display that showed a map of Europe with multiple locations marked in red. "In 72 hours, the first phase of our operation begins. Coordinated attacks in 6 major cities, using weapons that will demonstrate capabilities your government has never seen deployed against civilian populations." Margaret studied the map, memorizing locations and timing information that intelligence analysts would need to prevent the attacks. But she also understood that Kozlov was showing her this information for a reason. "Unless," she prompted. "Unless certain financial arrangements are made," Kozlov replied. "Your government has resources that my clients need for expanding operations beyond Europe. In exchange for those resources, the initial attacks could be delayed, perhaps indefinitely." Margaret realized with growing horror that she wasn't just looking at a weapons development program. She was seeing the beginning of a new kind of international terrorism, one that used advanced weapons technology to extort concessions from governments that couldn't afford to see their major cities attacked. "How much?" she asked. $500 million, transferred to accounts I will specify, plus immunity from prosecution for myself and my key personnel. Kozlov leaned back in his chair, studying Margaret's reaction. "I know it sounds excessive, but consider the alternative." Margaret calculated rapidly. The amount was enormous, but not impossible for intelligence agencies that dealt in black budgets and unofficial operations. The immunity would be harder to arrange, but not impossible if the threat was severe enough. But there's something else at work here, something that her instincts told her was more important than money or immunity. There's another option, she said carefully. Kozlov raised an eyebrow. I'm listening. You let me take my people and walk away. You shut down the weapons program. In exchange, I don't activate the explosive charges that my team placed around this facility's support structures while you've been talking to me. The silence that followed was so complete that Margaret could hear the hum of the laboratory equipment in distant rooms. Kozlov's eyes narrowed as he processed her statement, calculating probabilities and weighing options. You're bluffing, he said finally. Margaret activated her communication device and spoke a single code word. Within seconds, the building's lights flickered as Walker's demolition charges sent a harmless but unmistakable signal through the electrical system. My team has been in position since before I entered the building, Margaret explained. The charges are real, and they're powerful enough to bring down every structure in this complex. You have 10 minutes to decide whether you want to die here or live to fight another day. Kozlov stared at her for a long moment, then began to laugh. It was genuine this time, filled with the appreciation of one professional for another's tactical thinking. You always were better at this than most people gave you credit for, he said. Very well. Your people are in building 3, basement level. The guards have been instructed to release them upon my signal. He reached for a radio device on his desk, but Margaret held up a hand to stop him. First, you transfer all research data to my portable drive, she said, producing a device from her equipment pouch. Then, you signal your people to prepare for facility evacuation. Then, you release my operatives. And then, you blow up my facility anyway, Kozlov pointed out. Then, I blow up your facility anyway, Margaret confirmed. But you and your people have time to get clear, and you live to build another one somewhere else. Kozlov considered this for another moment, then nodded slowly. Acceptable terms. Though I suspect this won't be the last time our paths cross. The next 8 minutes proceeded with the mechanical precision of professionals executing a complex operation under time pressure. Kozlov transferred terabytes of research data to Margaret's drive, including information about the planned attacks, the weapons technology, and the international network that had funded the operation. The 3 surviving American operatives were released and escorted to the facility's main entrance, where Foster and the rest of Margaret's team waited to receive them. All 3 were in rough condition, but ambulatory, having endured interrogation and confinement, but not the kind of treatment that would prevent their eventual recovery. As the 10-minute deadline approached, Margaret and Kozlov walked together toward the facility's exit. Around them, his personnel were loading vehicles with equipment and files, preparing for the rapid evacuation that had always been part of their contingency planning. One question, Margaret said as they reached the main gate. Why did you really agree to this? The money would have been useful, and you could have fought instead of negotiating. Kozlov paused at his vehicle door. Because the weapons we developed here are too dangerous for anyone to possess, including the people who paid for their development. Some technologies are better off destroyed. Margaret watched as his convoy disappeared into the Moldovan countryside, then activated the charges that brought down 20 years of chemical and biological weapons research in a series of explosions that could be seen from 50 kilometers away. 3 weeks later, Margaret Torres stood once again in the hardware store in Millbrook, helping a customer choose the right type of screws for a deck repair project. The customer had no idea that the woman advising him about which screws had recently prevented terrorist attacks that could have killed thousands of people in 6 European cities. But this time, Margaret's civilian life felt different. The illusion of being nobody had been permanently shattered by the knowledge that she could never truly escape the shadows that had shaped her for 20 years. There would always be another Viktor Kozlov, another facility, another threat that required someone with her specific combination of skills and experience. The hardware store was still her sanctuary, and Millbrook was still her home. But Margaret Torres was no longer trying to become invisible. She was simply someone who sold hardware during the day and remained ready to save the world during the night. The phone in her pocket was no longer just for ordering inventory and calling suppliers. It was a direct line to people who knew that some threats could only be handled by someone who had spent 20 years learning to operate in the spaces between what was legal and what was necessary. Margaret Torres had finally found the balance between the person she had been and the person she wanted to be. She was no longer trying to be nobody. She was simply ready to be somebody whenever the world needed her to be.